Hello there, I'm Dr. Tyler Desplena, and this is my book, Foundations of Strongman Training. I've used my scientific training to perform brand new research studies on the sport of strongman and combined it with over a decade of personal experience competing in strongman and powerlifting to teach you how to train like the strongest people on earth. I've decided to make a video series on the content of the book. I'm going to share with you everything from how the book idea came to be to practical considerations for the insights gained from these scientific studies. By the end of this video series, you'll have the information you need to optimize your strongman training. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Foundations of Strongman Training. In the last episode, I went through a study I did on effort pattern classification and tried to determine what kind of distribution of effort patterns we see in the sport of strongman. So if that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and check that out. Today, though, we're going to talk about a different matter, which is the competitive nature of strongman athletes. In particular, I had a question here that was, how often do successful strongman athletes compete? So I did a study on this, and that's what we're going to discuss today. If you've followed along with this video series or with the sport of strongman in general, you will know that there is a large set of strongman skills, and that skills occur in unequal distribution. So you'll see within a contest, there'll be more of some events than others, or certain effort patterns than others. And across the strongman in general, that it's also an unequal distribution. So basically, no two contests are the same. What that means for athletes is that in order to reach their goals, in order to practice each skill enough, they're probably going to have to compete in a lot of different contests across their career, which means to make it to some of those big goals is probably going to be a multi-year journey. For the competitive strongman and strongwoman athlete, I see that there's three general types of goals that athletes have. The first is that they want to perform a certain skill with certain parameters. For example, you want to deadlift a certain weight, or you want to carry a certain weight yoke for a certain distance, right? So these are all based on performing a single skill with certain parameters, whether they're volume, intensity, frequency, whatever you want. So that's the first type of goal. The second type of goal is to achieve a certain rank or a certain title amongst your peers. So, for example, I live in Canada. Maybe you want to be Canada's strongest man or Canada's strongest woman. Maybe you want to be in the top 10 in the nation or the top 5 in your weight class, whatever it may be. That's the second kind of goal that athletes have. And the last kind of goal is to win a specific contest. Now, there's many reasons for this. For example, maybe winning a certain contest comes with certain prestige that you desire. Maybe it comes with a certain cash payout that might help you pay the bills or advance in the sport. Or, for example, like a World's Strongest Man winner, maybe it provides business opportunities that you can capitalize on in order to, drive your career and your financial freedom forward. So those are the three type of general skills that strong man, strong woman athletes have in the sport as I see it. The most important part, no matter which of these goals you have, is to be specific about it. You need to be able to specify the goals and the way you're going to measure against these goals so that you can determine if you've been successful or not. When I was trying to determine my approach for this study and trying to understand the competitive nature of strongman and strongwoman athletes, I realized, and I hope you do too, that there's a lot of variability. So obviously, first of all, we have humans, and they're humans trying to do hard, solve hard problems. So there's going to be a lot of variability in there, some of which I talked about in previous episodes, and we're not going to be able to account for all that. So there's a lot, but here we're analyzing humans, so we're stuck with that. On the goal side, I just explained three general types of goals, But obviously, there's a whole bunch of complexity that can go into that. You can have short and long term goals, you can have overlapping goals or sequential goals. You can have adversarial goals where you can only do one or the other at a single point in time, despite you as an athlete wanting to do them both. So, in order to reduce all that variability, I mean, as much as I could, I chose to study the world's strongest men. And we're going to get to the criteria in a bit. But first of all, I chose to study this group of athletes because they're the best at what they do. So, I mean, ideally, you'd like to look across the spectrum, but there's going to be more variability. So, let's stick with that. They're the best at what they do. Second, I chose them because their goal is very clear. Those top athletes, let's take, the world's strongest man and assume that that's the most prestigious contest. The goal of those athletes is to win that title. Some of the goals will be to be amongst the top best. So, say top 10 in the world as ranked in the final standings of the World's Strongest Man contest, as an example. The third reason I chose this pool of athletes is because the modern sport of strongman actually demands those top level athletes to act like professional athletes do in any other sport. So this removes a bunch of variability too, because most of their time, at least for the top guys, will be spent training and competing, right? So that's their focus. Now, if you contrast that to amateur athletes, the sport is not their main concern of life, right? They have other things that they spend their time on. They have families and work, maybe businesses and education and everything else that comes on with life. Not saying professional athletes don't have that either, but they're able to put their lives in a way where they can focus almost exclusively on training and competing, whereas amateurs don't have that luxury or haven't set up that kind of life for themselves. So, because of that, with the amateurs, there's a lot of variability on how often you might compete versus training and all of that. Whereas the professionals, it's more straightforward. You can think about professionals, professional strongman and strongwoman athletes as a bunch of big, jacked, muscly monks whose temple is blood and flesh, right? So that the performance of their body is their main priority. And so data from this pool of athletes is what I used in the study. Before we get into the study, I want to discuss a very important trade off that I think is exemplified by professional athletes, although it's there for any athlete. And I want to discuss some of the variability with that and how, in the end, that trade off is really the big decision that has to be made when athletes and coaches are trying to determine their competitive schedule. So let's consider first that we have the ideal athlete. And I mean this in terms of their, time spent on different activities. So the ideal athlete would only spend their time on four things: fueling their body, recovering from training or competition, training, and actually doing the competitions. Now, let's assume this ideal athlete that the fuel and recovery time are constant. So they eat the same thing every day, they sleep the same amount, they're amazing at recovering from whatever stimulus is, produced in training or competition. So those times are constant. And that will simplify this discussion, which is why I'm suggesting that. This athlete then basically has two things to choose between: training and competing. So, your time's limited. Which one are you going to choose? You better choose wisely, right? Now, the more you compete, the less time you have to train and get stronger in between each of those competitions. For example, if you competed every weekend, how much of the week before and after each contest is going to be, useful in terms of getting stronger? If you're the ideal athlete, who knows? But nobody's the ideal athlete, so probably you won't have any time to get stronger, right? You'll just be recovering from one contest and going and beating yourself up at the next. But hopefully that helps you understand that there's this trade-off between, competition frequency and how much time you have spent for training. Now, That's the simplest form, but this gets a bit more complex. So let's discuss that a bit further, right? So, first of all, competition pushes you to or beyond your maximum capabilities. Let's assume the case here, like where we don't get injured. So you're pushed beyond, but you still survive. Okay. Now, every competition that does this costs you extra fatigue and tissue damage, right? So training costs you some fatigue and tissue damage, but if you're training optimally, it's your ability to recover covers that, and you're able to get back to training. Competition usually isn't like that, right? Because you're trying to win or set some big goals or meet some big goals you want to do. So you're going to push beyond those limits, which is going to cost you extra time to recover because of the extra fatigue and damage you're going to do. So that means you're going to not only spend more time recovering, like sleeping, getting massages, things like that, you're going to spend more time eating because your body's going to need extra fuel in order to repair that damaged tissue and help you dissipate that. So that's kind of the first thing to consider, that even if we had to choose between training and competing alone, competing isn't just like a 1 day thing and you can get back to training right away. It induces a ton of fatigue, in most cases, which we'll talk about later, injuries to some, to some degree or severity. And so every competition has factors to consider that are after the competition, right? In terms of recovery and refueling there. Now, the second intricacy to, kind of throw into the mix here is that both training and competition increase your injury risk. And especially as you're approaching your, maximum capacity or capabilities. In training, when you're training with lighter weights, far away from contest, you don't have drastically increased, injury risk here. But as that training gets heavier and you approach contests and you ramp things up, the risk is going to increase, right? And then obviously we talked about competition, you're pushing beyond your capabilities, or you're trying to do that at least. And so that's going to increase injury risk. Now, my intuition, and I hope, you agree with this too, is that those two scenarios are going to increase injury risk. But I wanted to know, is there any data in the scientific literature about like how much that might be? Or is it even true? Like, did somebody study this at all? And how does it compare to other kind of strength sports or strength dominant sports? So that's what I did. I took a look at the literature, and at the time when I first looked, there wasn't any kind of meta-analysis or things like that. Although there is one that's come up more recently, which I'll share with you in a second. But let's look at a few that I found when I first started looking. So the first article I found here was actually about CrossFit athletes. So you can be upset with me or fight me whether you think CrossFit is a strength-related sport or not, but it has some of the similar movement patterns that we do in strongman, powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting. So I put it in here just as a comparison's sake. Okay, don't get too mad. So this study found that 56% of the participants that were surveyed suffered or reported suffering one or more injuries in the last 12 months. Okay, so here in these studies, I was looking at like injury rates, reported injury rates, right? So that's for CrossFit. Obviously, this is one study, so just relax. Follow along with me here. Second, I found an article written by Andrew Patton here. He surveyed powerlifters, and 64% of the participants reported sustaining an acute injury during their career. So not as specific as the last 12 months, but 64%. An acute injury here, I'm going to assume, meant something pretty severe where you had to like stop training for a bit or change your training or maybe move your goals, right? 64% of powerlifters. So when you're doing three motions, right, in contest, and 64% of them have some kind of acute injury. Okay, starting to get a bit more. So we have CrossFit with the least, powerlifting's next. Now, and this is the only study I could find on it to date, what about strongman? Well, Winwood and his colleagues also surveyed strongman athletes, They found that 82% of participants reported suffering injuries, and 20% of them reported needing one or more weeks of training completely off. So, not just like modifying your training to keep going, but no training at all. So, obviously, pretty severe. 82%. So, obviously, we had CrossFit at 56, we have powerlifting at 64, and we have strongman at 82%. Now, when I looked at this kind of injury risk and I tried to correlate it to my experience, I thought, man, 82% is really high. Like, probably no one would do the sport if that was actually true. But when I thought about my own experience, I thought, man, I'm part of the 82%. And I thought, of all the contests I've been to, all the people I've trained with, like, yeah, maybe it is actually that high. And I would actually say if you train strongman for like 2 or more years, it's probably 100%. Now, the severity, we don't have to go into that. Obviously, what do you term an injury? Is a muscle strain an injury versus a broken bone? We don't have to like tease that out. But I think that if you train a couple years or more, you'll learn how to produce so much force and you won't have mastered all the skills at such a level that you'll sustain some kind of injury. Might be like muscle strains or ligament strains, or you might drop a keg on your toe and break it, something like that. But it's going to happen. Based on my experience, I would say it's like 100%. Something is going to give if you're pushing hard enough for long enough. So when I came to think about it, I don't think there's been a competition I've been a part of. I've competed in like 40 or so. I've been a part of maybe 10 or 20 others. I don't think there was one of those where someone didn't injure something. Now, people, weren't like tearing pecs every time or blowing biceps off the bone, but there was something that happened, right? Something where that person couldn't finish the skill they were trying to perform. Maybe it's just like a callus split open. You couldn't finish a farmer's walk, calf cramps or something. You couldn't finish your squats. I've seen people crush their fingers on things, something like that. But it's almost always happened. Now, the extreme of this is for myself personally. I actually had one competition where I think it was 6 events, and I hurt myself on 5 of those 6 events. Um, First event, I hit myself in the forehead with a circus dumbbell as it was bringing it back down. Think then I threw a sandbag and like strained my neck muscles. The deadlift event, I pulled muscles in my lower back. We had to lift a natural stone and carry it. Something popped in my bicep when I was doing that. And then we had like an Atlas stone load at the end. And when I got the Atlas stone on my lap, something popped in my hip and I almost, dropped the stone on my legs. So it was brutal. And here's a little picture of that so you can just see what the face of injury in strongman looks like. But basically, all of that is to say that I think I agree that strongman has the highest injury rate. The studies, obviously, that I shared also suggest this. And then, as I mentioned before, Seraphim et al. Did a meta analysis across different sports and had the same conclusion. They obviously included Winwood's study in there, the only one that was available on strongman, and it had the highest, injury rates that were reported by the participants of those, surveys. So, why am I discussing injury risk? Well, it's because every time you push your limits, you have the risk of pushing your limits back to zero or towards zero, right? Every injury doesn't put you right back to zero. Some of them do, right? So if you tear your bicep, you're at zero for a while. You have to have surgery, probably, if it's come off the bone, and then you have to do a whole rehabilitation cycle just to get you back to like a normal bicep function, right? Normal elbow function. And then you have to get into the training and get yourself back up to some normalcy in terms of where you were before. And then from there, you can start actually thinking about competing, training heavy, and actually pushing your limits further and further, right? So why does this, why am I talking about this so much? Is because it affects that trade off between training and competition. If you compete more frequently, and obviously you don't maybe add in extra time for recovery, so you're just choosing between competing and training, what's going to happen is that injury risk is there. You're going to get injured. And then, sure, you competed more than you would have otherwise, but now you're injured and you can't train either. So every competition has this risk of injury, and it comes at the cost of training time, right? And obviously, it's not just like I said, not just training from where you are moving forward. You actually go backwards, sometimes all the way to zero, and you have to work all the way back, which could take months, could take years, depending on the injuries you have and the level that you want to compete at. So that's another intricacy of this trade-off that isn't apparent on the surface of just choosing between competing and training. Okay, given the discussion so far, I hope you agree with me that as strongman athletes, strongwoman athletes, we cannot just compete every weekend of the year. We will destroy ourselves, and most likely we'll pick up a career-ending injury and careers before we complete the goals, and those goals will remain as dreams, right? So now, given that, I wanted to see what is the optimal competition frequency, right? Had anyone studied this in the literature to try to determine, let's say, how many times per year, and I use that metric because that's what I used in the study, does a successful athlete compete? So I looked in the literature. I'll share, a few examples here of studies. Winwood was very active in this, and colleagues. They did a couple studies here on strongman athletes. They looked at the number of years of competing for different levels of athletes. However, they didn't look at competition frequency. So they would say, their data showed that there was, amateur athletes competing for X amount of years on average, or professional, international professionals competing for Y amount of years on average, but they didn't look at in each year how often are people competing. So these studies were all I could find on the topic. As I mentioned in previous episodes, there isn't a lot of scientific literature on the sport of strongman. And so this was all we have to go with, which means that there is no indication about what the competition frequency, the yearly competition frequency of successful athletes is, or of any strongman athletes for that matter. So I decided, well, why don't I take a first stab at it? And that's what I did for the study that's presented in Chapter 5 of Foundations of Strongman Training. Okay, so let's get into the details of the study. The data set that I used was focused on understanding the yearly competition frequency of the world's strongest men. In this data set, I included the World's Strongest Man Finals and the Arnold Strongman Classic from the years 2012 to 2023. Sorry. Two notes though, there was no Arnold Strongman Classic in 2021, so obviously that data is not there. And in World's Strongest Man Finals 2014, they had top 12 athletes, but in this study, I just took the top 10. So that was the pool of data I used. Now, the data itself, basically what I did was I took for each year and each of those two competitions, I noted the placing. So in both cases, it would be the top 10. In that 2014, I just took the top 10 and I left out the last two. And I looked up on Strongman Archives the corresponding number of international competitions for the athlete that got each placing. So in my study, I didn't really care about who the athletes were. Be interesting to look at that later. But I just took the placings, right? So first through 10th, and I noted the number of international competitions that athlete competed in that same year. Now, just so you have my definition, an international competition is a competition where athletes at the top level are participating from two or more countries. Now, one thing to note about the athletes who did these placings is, some of them would have competed at least in a national championship. For example, we have Canada's Strongest Man here in Canada, and some of these finalists from World's Strongest Man would have also done the nationals. However, that's not an international competition, so it didn't get counted in the study here. I just wanted to make that note so it's clear. So in total, I had 230 top 10 placings and the associated yearly competition frequency, and that's the base of the data set I used for this study. Now, because there was no studies before looking at this, I just picked a few different statistical analysis, things I wanted to compare between that I thought might affect the number of competitions for each of the different placings. And I just performed statistical analyses on that. So I did 4 different ones. Let me list them off here. First, I compared between placings. So, for example, did first place compete more or less often each year than second place, and so on and so forth. Next, number 2, I compared between podium finishers and non-podium finishers. So is the yearly competition frequency of the podium finishers statistically different than the non-podium finishers? Third, I compared between contests. So do the athletes who place top 10 in World's Strongest Man finals, compete more or less often than the athletes who compete at the Arnold Strongman Classic? As you can imagine, there's a bunch of overlap between those, a lot of overlap in some years. And fourth, I looked at the different comparisons between each year, right? So did top 10 placings in 2016 significantly differ from ones in 2017, so on and so forth. So those are the 4 different types of comparisons I did using statistical analyses. Now, one note here, this data was collected from athletes that were at different points in their career, and that wasn't accounted for in this study, but I do think it's an interesting future study to look at the competition frequency of an athlete as they go throughout their strongman career, right? And maybe even look at, like we were talking about before, how injuries affect that competition frequency. Anyways, I'm digressing here, but I just thought that would be something to note and an interesting future study. Now let's jump into the results of this study. First, let's look overall. So on average, and I'm going to show you here table 9 from the book, the world's strongest men compete 6 plus or minus 3 times per year. So just to repeat that, on average, 6 times plus or minus 3, if you're including the standard deviation. Now, if you take a look at table 9 here, you can see that the average actually doesn't deviate too much between placings, which I thought was kind of surprising. But the lowest here to note being 4 plus or minus a couple competitions per year. But you see it's pretty consistent. However, what I would like you to do is take a look at the range of competition frequencies. So we have as little as 1 time per year from these top level athletes, and as many as 19 competitions per year, which is pretty crazy if you ask me, especially competing at that highest level. So, fun fact here, Hafthor Bjornsson is the person who holds, I think, the only data point here where you have an athlete competing once in a year and winning one of these 2 prestigious contests, World's Strongest Man Finals or the Arnold Strongman Classic. And I think that was in 2020, which was, I believe, his last competition before he took a break from the sport. And now he's back, which is great to see, honestly. I've always enjoyed watching Hafthor compete, and it's great to see him come back and still be one of the top athletes. Now, another fun fact, if we look at the other end of the spectrum, somebody here performed 19 competitions per year. Think about that. That's like a contest every other week or every 3 weeks, which is pretty crazy. And that person was Mr. Krzysztof Radzikowski of Poland. If you followed the sport for a while, I'm sure you saw Mr. Radzikowski, come to prominence. In the year that he competed 19 times, this is even crazier, he finished with a 5th place or better at 18 of those 19 competitions. And I just want you to take that in for a second if you're familiar with the sport or not. competing once every 2 to 3 weeks is crazy, but placing in the top five or higher uh, is really impressive. And I imagine your body would feel broken after this. And I would imagine that this kind of competition frequency is, a contributing factor to why we didn't see, Mr. Radzikowski stay a lot longer in the sport because, man, did that guy have some crazy pressing power and just an overall pretty good athlete. So that's kind of the highlights to take away from the results here. I would like to know from you, though, how often do you compete each year? Let me know in the comments. Now, moving on to statistical analyses, unfortunately, I did not see any statistically significant differences in yearly competition frequency amongst any of the factors that were tested. So, were there no differences between placing statistically, between podium versus non podium finishers, between people who participate in the World's Strongest Men finals and Arnold Strongman Classic, or between the different years that the data was collected for? Now, I would love to redo this with a larger sample size because I have an intuition that there is some differences or there would be some differences, but just the sample size is way too small given the variability inherent to that. We talked about a bit earlier in this episode the variability with goals, injuries, career outlook, and other things that come along with your life. So I think we might find something if we had a much larger sample size, right? And obviously, it'd be nice to look at amateur and professional athletes. Okay, so I didn't find any statistical, meaningful differences here, but I did notice a trend I wanted to point out. So I looked at the yearly competition frequency for each year, right? And what you can see here is that the maximum yearly competitions, so the maximum that any athlete competed in, dropped almost in half from 2012 to 2023. So it went from 15 was the maximum in the year 2012, and it went to 8 in the year 2023. And also, you see it reflected in the average. So on average, the yearly competition frequency over the same time period went from 7 to 5. Now, why I think this is important, something to keep your eye on, is that it indicates that top strongman athletes are actually competing less often on average. And, this study isn't going to reveal why that is, but it's an interesting trend to see and something we can follow up on. Okay, so I know you're probably sad like me. There was no statistically significant findings in this study. As a scientist, those are really exciting, and you hope to find them, but they're not always there. But there's still some interesting things we can discuss. So let me discuss a few points with you. The first is that the majority of professional athletes compete between 3 and 9 times per year, with the average being 6. What's cool about this is this wasn't in the literature before. Now it's there. So you have some kind of guidance on it. But I want to just point out here, I think that it's likely going to happen that amateurs compete less than professionals do on average. And there's a few factors why. Let me lay them out. First, I think amateurs are likely to make poor training decisions as competition frequency increases. This is the reason, at least one of the major reasons those amateurs are not professionals yet, because they don't make good training decisions. So basically, when things hurt after contests, they just keep pushing through more contests, more contests. Whereas a professional athlete is able to take a step back, assess, do the rehab work, whatever recovery stuff, take whatever time is needed to get back to, their expected physical shape that they need to be in order to meet their goals, right? The second reason is that strongman is an expensive hobby. So amateurs get almost no compensation. You might get like a plastic trophy or something to take home if you win. There's very little cash payouts these days. When I started, there was a bit more, which was pretty cool. And so between your food, your travel, if you take any performance enhancing drugs, the personal protective equipment, buying equipment for your home gym to train, all of this stuff, it's super expensive. And so I think that that means that amateurs are less likely to compete. For example, if you're an amateur, you work a regular 9 to 5 job, like how much vacation time can you get off so you can go compete every weekend, right? So that's the second reason I think amateurs will compete less frequently. And the third one is that there may be a lack of competitions in the athlete's region. When you're at the top levels, you get invited all over the world to compete, right? People want you as an athlete. They want to have your entertainment and performance value. When you're an amateur athlete, people don't know who you are. And also, if you live in, like, for example, in Canada, we have a huge geography. There might only be one promoter in your area, and they put on one show per year. So unless you're going to drive hours or fly hours to go to different contests, you might just not have as many competitions in your region. And that's also going to be the last reason here that I think amateurs will compete less often per year than professionals. Now, I actually have a recommendation about this. Based on this finding here, just to reiterate, most professionals compete between 3 and 9 times per year. My recommendation is to start with 3 times per year as a training or as a competition frequency goal. Now, why is that? First of all, it's aligned with the data that we see in the study. So if you compete 3 times per year, you're at the lower end of where the majority of the professionals are. So that indicates that you're probably preparing yourself in an equivalent manner to professionals in terms of competition frequency, right? Now they may compete more than you, but 3 was that bottom range of the standard deviation. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that the minimum competition frequency required to get to and win a nationals championship, if that's your goal, is 3 typically. For example, in Canada, I believe in the US as well, and other places, you have a regional, provincial, or state, and then national contests that you have to do. So you have to go to a regional show, you have to get so many points or a certain placing, you get invited to provincials or your state championship. If you have a certain placing there, then you get invited to nationals, and then obviously you have your chance to compete there for the big title. So that's the minimum 3 times per year you will need in order to achieve or even get a chance at achieving that goal of a national title, right? Okay. Now the third reason is that there's still lots of time in the year to get stronger. So if you only compete 3 times per year, you have I think like 17 weeks or something in between each contest if they're equally spaced. Now, like in Canada, where I am, they're not equally spaced, right? Usually you have a strongman season, something like from April to October, right? Half a year or something like that. But if they were, and even then, it still gives you lots of time to get stronger per year. And if you're competing in a regional, provincial, national kind of format, they usually give you enough, 8, 12 weeks in between each of those contests. So you still have time to get stronger. You can recover from the last contest and still get some gains before you jump into the next one. So that's the reasons why I think 3 is a great place to start for amateur athletes. If you're beginning, try 1, see how it goes. But if you have some goals where it's like, I want to, be a certain rank or win a certain title, I think 3 times per year is a great place to start for most people. All right, the next, discussion point here I want to have is around the range of competition frequency. So, going into this, I knew there was some top level strongmen. For example, Big Z talked about how much he competed when he was younger. So I knew it was going to be a big number, but I didn't expect it to be from 1 to 19 competitions per year. 19 per year, that's 1 every 2.7 weeks if they're evenly spaced out. That's a crazy demand on your body. And competing once per year and winning, as I mentioned before, one of these big titles is quite the feat in itself because, you're probably not going to have that happen as a rookie. Although, Mitchell Hooper comes to mind as probably one of the best rookie performances, but it's not very likely, right? Those are the rare cases. You're not usually going to step in your first contest and do one contest and win the biggest title. Um, what we can see is there's a huge range here, which indicates that there's a lot of factors that play into competition frequency. For example, if strongman is your job, so winning and that money you get from winning is your job, you're going to be tending to compete more often because, you know, you might not win every contest and you need that money to survive, provide for your family, whatever it is. And then there's some cases where, and maybe you'll see this towards the end of people's career where they're just picking a couple of shows per year. Their body can't handle the stress like it used to. They still love doing it. And so, competition frequency is lower. But another thing I want you to keep in mind with this range is that this is for professionals. So, as I mentioned, I'd love to study amateur athletes, but none of that data was available right now. Hopefully, it will be in the future. Even still, though, I think once per year is going to be great for amateurs. Once per year is something really good. You have like a definitive date where you're going to test yourself and you can use that as an anchor for all your training. So it takes kind of the mental load off. I don't know about you, but when I don't have a specific date or competition in mind, then like you can your mind can wander and so can your training along with that. So once per year is great. A great place to start, and it's something that's probably sustainable for like a really long, for like decades, if if you're careful about it and you take care of your body. Now, again, I don't recommend competing 19 times per year, but this data at least shows that it's possible. So if you want to do it, all the power to you. If you do it though, or maybe Mr. Radzikovsky, Big Z, anyone else who's listening that has competed very frequently, I'd love to talk to you about it. I'd love to hear how you manage to do that. I think the most times I've ever competed in a year was like 6 or 7, and that was pretty brutal. So 19 is impressive. Let me know. Love to hear about it. I would say though that amateurs are going to again be below that 6, that average we saw for professionals, and that's just simply because of a strongman season. At least here in Canada, I know some places might be different. A lot of it has to do with our weather. That strongman season is constrained to like 5 or 6 months of a year typically, and so fitting 6 contests or 19 contests in 6 months is probably going to destroy you. And if it doesn't, we can get back to the trade-off I mentioned. You probably won't have very much time for training. It'll be just like I have it in season, I only compete, I don't really train, and then hopefully you can get stronger in the off season. Anyways, that range of competition frequency, now it's there for you to reference. And I would say that amateur athletes, anyone starting out, should stick to the lower end of that. Like I said, 3 or less, and give that a try first. You can always do more. Okay, last discussion point before we move on. And that is that the yearly competition frequency is trending downward. So I showed you before that the maximum and the average of this metric are trending downward. On average, we went from 7 at the start of the data set, 2012, to 5 on average at the end, 2023. Now, I have some thoughts on why this might be, so let me list them out for you. First of all, the competitiveness in the sport keeps growing. So we have bigger athlete pools, right, who are stronger than ever before. And that makes it harder to get invitations to shows because there's a bigger pool of athletes for the promoters to pick from, and also harder to stay healthy because, you know, people who are injured just get replaced by people who are healthy and super strong. And so you're always pushing your limits, which means you get injured more often, so on and so forth. So that's the first reason. The second one, why I think it's trending downward, is that social media actually has played a really big part in raising the knowledge and awareness about injuries and recovery considerations. 2 examples come to mind of social media strongmen, which are Martins Licis and Mateusz Kieliszkowski. So you can go watch their YouTube videos from the previous years, and they discuss all about their injuries and how they've had to take time away from the sport, how much of it, in order to come back and compete at that highest level. And I think that has shown people that if you take care of your body like that, you can come back and compete at those highest levels, but that it's going to need, you're going to have to dedicate that time and commit yourself to it. And so I think social media has raised awareness. And so people are actually listening to their bodies and like doing those things so that they can prolong their careers, right? Now, the third reason here is I think that the prize money has potentially had a lot to do with this. I'd love to hear from some pros about strong woman, strong man. I don't care about what they think on the prize money. If you're at the top and strong man is your job or your main avenue for income, whether it's directly winning contests or through other associated business opportunities, the prize money you get allows you to compete less often. So if in the past, maybe when I started strongman, winner of World's Strongest Man got like $50,000 US, something like that. It's not nothing, but they probably spend double that on their bodies just to be able to be on that stage and compete per year, right? Now you have shows like the Shaw Classic, Rogue Invitational. Their first place is getting like over $100,000 just for one show, right? So if you're at the top, someone like Mitchell Hooper has won a bunch of these, you're actually making like a pretty substantial amount of money compared to the average, say, salary in your country. And that allows you to not have to compete as much, right? That money can sustain you longer, sustain your family longer. And then even the lower positions in each contest are getting an increased prize payout. So I think that might have people, you know, might give people the ability to not compete so often. So that's the last reason why I think it's trending downwards. But I'd love to hear from some of the people on the top of the sport and get the real reasons from them. Okay, so that's the end of the discussion. Those are some of my thoughts on the results and how we can interpret them and apply them to our training. Let's move on to talking about some of the limitations. The first limitation is sample size. I mentioned this before. Obviously, I would love to have a bigger one. Humans are at the heart of this. There's a lot of variability in themselves and what they're trying to achieve with their lives. A bigger sample size might, in the end, might not work, but I'd love to have it and perform the study and have some more insights there. The second limitation is that athletes included in this study were at different stages of their career. And so, as you might imagine, like athletes early in their career can probably afford, at least from a physical standpoint, to compete more often than athletes at the end of their career who are really, beaten and battered from all the years of battles. So, that's the second limitation. The third one is that injuries derail your ability to compete, and they weren't considered in this study, right? I didn't go through for each of the athletes and determine in each year, did they have a major injury or not? How severe was it? Those things are people's personal medical, data anyways. So it's not like you could get it. You could get pieces of it from broadcasts and stuff like that, but it wouldn't be easy to correlate all that data. You probably have to do interviews, which I wasn't able to for this study. But I just wanted to mention that that's a limitation. Every injury you have is going to take away your ability to compete, most likely in most cases. And so it should be considered a limitation. The fourth limitation is that the data set itself obviously was limited. It's only professional data. It's only the World's Strongest Man finals and Arnold Strongman Classic. So there's not other top shows in there these days. And so in the future, obviously, a bigger sample size with more of that variation in people and where they're at in their careers, amateurs, professionals, all of that. That's really going to help us probably find any statistically significant differences if they exist. So I hope in future studies I'm able to address these limitations, maybe larger sample size, maybe different factors in the data set in order to understand just, what makes these athletes successful at the top of the sport. Okay, so there you have it. Now you have the first study on the yearly competition frequency of strongman athletes. Sorry, ladies, I didn't include any strong woman data, but be sure to get that in the next study. I shared with you the results. I shared with you my thoughts, and I hope you'll take those into consideration whenever you're trying to determine your competitive schedule. And just remember, the big takeaway here is that there's a trade-off between competing more often and your training time. I mentioned a bunch of other factors to consider, but that's at the heart of it, right? Every time you compete, you need to recover. You also need to prepare. That's less time doing more general strength training and improving your skills. So I want you to always keep that in mind. Ask yourself, is doing that next competition the right thing for me? You know, is 6 times per year right for you? 3, 19, 1? Only you can answer that, but I hope what I've shared with you will help you in making those decisions. And just in case you forgot, my recommendation, especially for amateur athletes, is to start with 3 times per year. It's enough frequency for you to hone your skills in across, a few years, but it's enough time in between in order for you to heal up and still have time to gain strength on the skills that you desire between each competition. All right, that's it for today's episode. I hope you found it helpful. I hope it helps you when determining your competition schedule and laying out your training. I know there wasn't any big, profound statistical findings from this study, but that's okay. We still provided the first answer to the question, which was how often do successful strongman athletes compete? The answer, in case you forgot, was 6 times per year on average. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to discuss takeaways from across the book, Foundations of Strongman Training. I'm going to distill them into a set of principles. And then for each one, I'm going to take you through my thoughts on how you can structure your training based on these principles and how you can hopefully optimize your performance, whether it's, in training or in competition. So as always, thanks for watching and take care.